Whether you're learning how to interview other people at a company like Microsoft or Google or some other big tech company, or you're getting prepared to be interviewed yourself, the whole process can seem fairly mysterious if you haven't gone through it before. If you've done your research looking on YouTube and the web and so on, then you probably found a lot of information about individual interviews. However, I haven't been able to find anything that talks about the process from start to finish. So how does the process work? Hi, my name is John Miller, the Deliberate Engineer. I've spent the last 30 years working at big tech companies like Google, Amazon, Microsoft, and so on. I've been an individual contributor for most of that time, but I've also been a manager and a manager of managers. Just as I've held those roles, I've also interviewed people for those roles. I've interviewed hundreds of people over the course of my career, and I've been interviewed myself dozens of times. Today we're going to talk about the interview process from start to finish. Later videos will include more information about specific types of interviews, but for now we're going to focus on just understanding how somebody goes from wanting a job at a place to how they wind up actually getting that job. First, you need to understand the process from the company's point of view. From their perspective, they're losing money by not having all the people they need to get work done. Their goal is to hire people who are good enough to succeed at the company as quickly and cheaply as possible. It means they don't want to spend a lot of extra money on the recruitment process if it's not paying dividends. Now, in the software industry, there's always openings, but there's also a lot of different candidates. So the process needs a way of winnowing down those candidates to a manageable number. I divide the recruiting process into 6 stages. The earlier stages evaluate more candidates, but it spends much less time per candidate. The further along you get in the process, the fewer candidates you're evaluating, but the more thoroughly you're evaluating them. Here's a diagram showing the 6 stages of the interview process. Wider blocks in the diagram mean that more people are being evaluated. Taller blocks in the diagram mean that the people are being evaluated more thoroughly. As you can see, it starts out with a very wide 0 stage, ending with a stage that's just a person or two wide by the time it gets to the end of it. The first stage is sourcing, where possible candidates are identified and preliminary filtering is done. The second stage is an HR screen, where the HR person decides whether it's worth involving engineers to evaluate the candidate further. The third stage is a tech screen, usually done by an engineer. It's about the length of a single interview. The fourth stage is a full set of interviews, typically done on-site, takes about a day. The fifth stage is evaluation of the interview results. This is usually done as a sort of debrief. And the final stage, if the candidate makes it that far, is deciding whether or not there's going to be an offer, and if so, putting that offer together and sharing it with the candidate. Let's take a look at each of these stages in a bit more detail. Stage 1 is the sourcing of candidates. Sometimes this is done by a dedicated sourcer, a person who goes out and finds good candidates, talks to them, and sort of pre-qualifies them. Other times it's done through internal referrals, where somebody already working at the company says they have a good idea of somebody else who could join the company and pass their information along to the recruiter. The third and the biggest source of candidates for sourcing is actually cold applications. Those are people who mail in their resumes, or they click a button to apply, or they apply for a specific position, often with a cover letter. Typically for sourcing, the applications and the cover letters are run through some sort of a keyword match and other automatic analysis tools that will help decide whether it's worth looking at the candidate. This may seem a little harsh, but when you're talking about thousands or tens of thousands of candidates for a single person to evaluate in a couple days, then it starts to make a lot of sense, at least from the company's perspective. If the candidate passes that initial screening by the automated tools, the next step is for the HR recruiter to take a look at the candidates who passed and see whether it's worth talking to them in person to try and match them with the job in the company. Typically, the amount of time they'll spend will be anywhere from a few seconds to a minute. So you really want to make sure that your application and the cover letter are very easy to read, and that the information a recruiter might be interested in is very accessible. Stage 2 is the HR screen. At this point, the sourced candidate has been looked at and determined to be good enough to be worth pinging and actually having a conversation with. The HR recruiter will reach out to the candidate, see if they can set up a time to talk, typically over the phone, maybe over video conferencing, occasionally in person. At that talk, the HR person will get to the candidate's quality, the veracity of their resume, their interest in the company, and how good a fit they would be for further evaluation. Typically, an HR recruiter is armed with a question provided by the people who have open positions. This question is something that's relatively easy to interpret, but anybody who has a shot at being a good candidate should know the answer. For example, some screening questions might be to ask a candidate, what is a loop? What is an X509 certificate? What are certificates used for? What is the World Wide Web? What is HTTP? How would you make a list in JavaScript? If the candidate makes it past stage 2, then they move on to stage 3, which is typically a tech screen by an engineer. The candidate's details are passed along to the hiring manager. The hiring manager takes a look and see whether it's worth investigating time, whether they think there's a possibility this person would be a good hire for the company. If so, then either the hiring manager or some trusted delegate will set up a 30 to 60 minute interview with the candidate. Again, it can be online, it can be over the web, through WebRTC or something, or it could be in person. Now, the technical screen is typically a technical interview where you get asked a programming question and you get asked more specific questions about your background and things that the person doing the tech screen thinks will indicate whether you're worth interviewing or not. The bar is a little lower for the tech screen than it is for the interviews. That's because an hour isn't long enough to make an informed decision about whether somebody will make a good employee. Instead, you're just trying to see whether it's worth the time and cost of bringing them in for a full day of interviews. At the end of the tech screen, the screener goes and writes up a summary of their conversation and they make a decision. Interview or no interview? For the candidates who make it past the technical screen, there's usually a full day of interviews that are set up. The recruiter works with the candidate to find a day or a couple of days that'll work to have several one-hour interviews. These interviews are typically one-on-one with an engineer for each interview, a different engineer each time. It'll be a variety of different types of questions. You might get asked coding questions, design questions, soft questions, architecture questions. You could be asked testing questions. You could be asked to demonstrate leadership qualities. Typically, the interview will have about the same structure for all of these different interviews, but the meat of the interview, the core 30 minutes of it, will be one of these specialized areas. The interview process is really about gathering information. To a lesser extent, the candidate is gathering some information about the company to see if they want to work there and what the expectations are. But the recruiter is gathering information about the candidate. They're trying to decide, is this a person who's likely to be a good hire? Are there any signs that they wouldn't be a good hire? The hiring process is very conservative. So the way it works is, if the person who's doing the interview can't find evidence that they're a good hire, for example, they just weren't able to get enough information, then they're required to say no hire for that interview. It doesn't mean that the candidate can't get the job at all, but it certainly doesn't support the case for hiring them. This means that it's in the interest of both the interviewer and the candidate to make sure that the conversation is a high bandwidth conversation that provides lots of information to make a hiring decision. If you find yourselves veering off into topics of mutual interest that aren't related to whether or not you get hired, you need to be careful and manage that time and pull things back into the interview where more information can be provided about whether or not to hire this person. After all the interviews are completed, then the candidate is sent on their way and the information is gathered. Each of the interviewers has to write up the results of their interview and give a hire or no hire decision, along with reasons why they think the person would be a good hire, things they're concerned about, or reasons why they don't think they would be a good hire. Once you've submitted the feedback that you have as an interviewer, then you're able to see the feedback from other interviews as well. Typically, everybody will read this information and there will be a debrief meeting sometime later. Often it's within a week of the interview. At the debrief meeting, the hiring manager usually leads people through a discussion of the interviews and the strengths of the candidate. Based on that discussion, a decision will be made whether or not to extend an offer to that candidate. It's typically not the case that you're waiting for 5 candidates and you pick the best one. Usually it's hard enough to find a good person for a commercial software engineering position that when you find a good one, you jump on them. Anyways, as people discuss the feedback and they relate their interviews with each other, generally speaking, if most of the interviews are no hire, it's a pretty short discussion and the person will not get hired. If there's only 1 or 2 no hires, then it's much more likely the person will at least have a chance and it leads to longer discussions. At the end of the debrief, there's a final decision, hire or no hire. Based upon that decision, let's say it's hire, then it gets passed back to the recruiter and the manager come up with an offer and communicate that to the candidate. If the decision is no hire, then the recruiter typically takes care of contacting the candidate and saying, thank you very much for your time. We had great conversations, but we don't feel that you're a great fit for this position at this time. Feel free to apply later in 6 months, something like that. Lots of times candidates will want more information about why they weren't offered a position, but in my experience, there's just no upside to giving this information. The few times I've tried, once or twice I've had people take the information in the spirit it's intended, but more typically it turns into an argument. And that argument doesn't have any winners. It leads to a lot of stress for the interviewer and a lot of hard feelings on the candidate's side, especially if they think they weren't treated fairly. If they don't get a clean signal saying, yes, this is a good hire for the company, then it's in their best interest not to hire them. The last stage, extending an offer. Along with extending an offer, some companies such as Google do something called team matching. In other words, the candidate wasn't necessarily interviewing for a particular team. They were interviewing to see if they meet the bar for the company. If they do, then they get matched with a set of teams based on the candidate's interests and the team's needs to see which one is going to be the best fit for it. That's team matching. It's relatively rare, so I'm not going to go into it any further in this video. So that's the interview process from start to finish. Now, if we take a look at the amount of time it takes for interviewing a candidate, I just have to look at my notes here. Typically, the first stage sourcing, per candidate, it will only take a couple of seconds to figure out if you want to interview them or not. After sourcing is complete, if you move on to an HR screen, the HR screen typically takes about an hour of the company's time. That's time for the recruiter to reach out and set up a time with the candidate and then to write up results at the end of it. For each technical screen, stage 3, that is done, that typically takes about 2 hours of an engineer's time. So part of that will be preparation, reading the feedback that's already been generated for that candidate, looking at their resume and their LinkedIn and so on, coming up with a set of questions, holding the interview, and then thinking about and writing up their feedback at the end and coming up with the interview, no interview decision. The fourth stage, the full interviews, that typically takes anywhere from half a day to a day to set up in the first place, with the recruiter identifying people who will perform the interviews, figuring out schedules, and taking care of travel information. And then probably another day to 2 days of engineer time. Each engineer, when they do one of these interviews, they'll typically take 15 to 30 minutes ahead of time to prepare. The interview lasts about an hour, and then they'll spend between half an hour and an hour preparing their feedback, making a decision, writing it up, and maybe glancing at the feedback other people had afterwards. The next stage, the debrief, that involves all the interviewers typically, plus a hiring manager and maybe an HR person, and that generally takes about an hour of time. There'll be some time reading everybody's feedback before the meeting begins, and then going and having the discussion. Very bad or very good candidates, the discussion is usually pretty short. Everybody else, it can take a full half hour, 45 minutes to make the decision. And then finally, coming up with the initial offer and communicating that, that's typically a half a day or a day of work. And then depending what happens after that, it can be much more. Now, if you add all of that up, you wind up with about, for every single candidate who goes through the whole process, all the way up to getting an offer generated, it's about 30 hours. That means if you have 100 candidates and you do that whole process for all 100 of them, you're talking about 3,000 hours of time, or let's say $300,000 of company time to do that evaluation to hire a single person. This is the reason that most companies will, instead of bringing everybody through the whole process, they try and separate out and filter at each of these stages to evaluate fewer and fewer people. Also, another motivation they have for this is the number of people that you evaluate determines how many people you have to dedicate to that task. That's dedicated HR people and recruiters, how many of those you need. And on the engineering side, every engineer that you have interviewing somebody isn't doing engineering while they're working on that. It's easy for a good interviewer to be spending half of their time on interviewers rather than engineering things. And that's a real cost to the company. So again, your motivation is to reduce the number of people that they have to interview or to get the most value out of their time. So let's say that you have that same list of 100 applicants and you winnow it down to a dozen through the filtering, through the original sourcing. A half dozen make it through the HR screen and go to the tech screen. 3 pass the tech screen, and then those 3 get interviewed. When you look at it that way, the math says that adds up to being 108 hours total of time, or roughly $11,000, and that's a much more reasonable amount of time. Again, the numbers I've heard for the cost of recruiting a single person successfully in a company, this is all the work it takes for filtering other people and interviewing other people and so on, is usually between $25,000 and $50,000 for a high-tech company. And that's pretty much everything I wanted to say about the process. If you have feedback on how the process worked at your company where it's substantially different, or even if it's similar, just sort of verifying, yeah, it works the same way at this company as well, I'd love to hear about it in the comments down below. If you found this video to be useful, it'd be great if you could subscribe and leave a like. I plan on making lots more videos about the interview process, both learning how to be a good interviewer and how to nail your interviews for big tech companies. And that's it. Thanks a lot for making it this far, and keep on pushing forward.